Have you ever wondered what eyes can reveal? Not just emotions or thoughts, but profound, inexplicable secrets hidden in the abyss of the soul. Princess Diana's eyes captivated the world, but they also carried a disturbing emptiness, as if she could see something no one else could. While crowds revered her, few dared to ask what truly lay behind that melancholic gaze. Welcome to another night where mysteries never sleep. I'm Midnight, and this is 7 Nights. Before we dive into this story filled with chilling revelations, remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue uncovering the most hidden secrets for you. Ready to discover what lurks in the shadows? Diana's eyes. Princess Diana's eyes always caught the world's attention. There was something about them that transcended the beauty or sweetness the media so often praised. Now, I know you're probably picturing that iconic gaze, but hold on. There's more to this story than meets the eye. While the crowd saw only a charismatic woman, some noticed a deep sadness that seemed endless. But it was more than that. It was as if she knew something no one else did, an invisible weight that never left her. Cameras captured a strange glimmer in her gaze, a kind of emptiness that contradicted the happiness she displayed for the public. The world adored her, but curiously, no one dared to question what was hidden behind that melancholic look. Many attributed this gaze to the crushing pressure of being part of the British royal family, a role that came with relentless exposure and scrutiny. But did that truly explain everything? The feeling that Diana viewed the world differently, as if she was always on alert, intrigued even those closest to her. Some of her close friends mentioned, on rare occasions, that Diana seemed lost in thought, as if she were hearing voices no one else could. It was almost as if she were connected to something beyond this world, something that constantly watched her. This something was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was always there. During official events or casual moments, there were seconds when her eyes seemed to drift into the void, as if she were searching for something, or someone, only she could see. This was most evident in public situations, where camera flashes and applause were impossible to ignore. She smiled, but her eyes didn't match the emotion. Many said it was an attempt to mask her unhappiness in her marriage, or to cope with the pressure of being the people's princess. But the truth seemed much darker. Diana mentioned this sensation in private conversations, but her words were always enigmatic. She spoke of a constant presence, something that seemed to have been with her since her rise to royalty. She once confided that she felt as if she were being watched, not by people but by something she couldn't describe. It was a presence that didn't touch her physically but followed her in thoughts, dreams, and especially in moments of greatest vulnerability. As a result, she began to doubt even her own perceptions, questioning whether she was imagining things or if something truly accompanied her. As the years passed, Diana's gaze grew heavier, and the public noticed. People said she had lost the sparkle that made her so special, but the truth was that her eyes had never been completely bright. They were a mirror of her soul, reflecting something that couldn't easily be explained. The emptiness, melancholy, and mystery behind her eyes told a story she was never able to share. It was as if they held a secret she would take to the grave, a secret she might not have fully understood herself. Diana's eyes were a window to what lay beyond appearances, beyond the perfect princess the world knew. While flashes captured her image, they also recorded the reflection of an inner abyss, a story that remained out of reach for words. With every photo, every immortalized moment, it seemed as though she wanted to scream something no one could hear. But the world never listened. And perhaps it was better that way, because what hid in her gaze was not something most would be ready to face. The supernatural pact. Diana was just 19 years old when her life took an unexpected turn. It was the end of a stifling summer in 1980, and she was in the midst of an engagement that would catapult her to the center stage of global attention. A shy young woman, still adjusting to the relentless gaze of the press, began to feel the weight of a life she hadn't chosen. It was during this vulnerable phase that something visited her. On a silent night, in her Kensington Palace apartment, an indescribable presence took form. This is the part of the story where you start wondering if it's just coincidence or something much bigger at play. Diana woke up in the middle of the night with the unsettling feeling that she was not alone. At the edge of her bed, it stood, tall, thin, with a deformed silhouette that seemed to bend the shadows around it. The figure was not human. Its eyes, black as abysses, glowed with restrained malevolence, while its voice resonated throughout the room. "You've been chosen," it said. Diana didn't know how to react. She was paralyzed with terror, but, at the same time, hypnotized by the entity that knew everything about her. It offered what any young woman might dream of, fame, love, the adoration of millions. You will be the most loved woman on earth, it promised. However, like every tempting offer, there was a price to be paid. It didn't immediately reveal what it wanted in return, but the guarantee that the moment will come left a mark on her mind. The scene was surreal, but the next morning, Diana tried to convince herself it had all been a dream. Perhaps the stress of the engagement and the transition to royal life had created that terrifying hallucination. But the oppressive heat that had filled the room still lingered, even as the morning sun streamed through the window. The absolute silence, as though the world had stopped to witness the encounter, echoed in her mind. Diana couldn't forget the experience, no matter how hard she tried. Something within her knew that the pact wasn't a fantasy conjured by her mind. From that moment on, everything changed. Diana's success was meteoric, and she quickly became the center of global attention. She won the hearts of England and the world with her beauty, charisma, and almost magical aura. But there was something more to her rise, a speed that seemed almost supernatural, as if invisible forces were propelling her to the top. Every smile, every camera flash, every headline about her kindness seemed part of a larger plan, something beyond anyone's control, including her own. What Diana didn't know was that the pact was alive, pulsating in her soul like a debt she didn't fully understand. The figure that had visited her in her bed hadn't disappeared. It was always there, watching, waiting for the right moment to reappear. The agreement, sealed that silent night, would mark not just her life, but also her death. What did it truly want? Diana might have already known the answer, but refused to admit it. The following years were full of glory and suffering, as if the pact were taking its toll bit by bit, devouring pieces of her happiness in exchange for her fame. Diana began to realize that something within her had changed. There was a growing emptiness, a constant sense that something precious had been taken. She would never be the same again. And although she continued to smile for the world, deep down she knew that, sooner or later, it would return. When that day came, she wouldn't be ready. The first manifestations. The pact made that night seemed like a distant dream, but its marks began to emerge slowly. Diana started noticing small things, easy to dismiss at first. Shadows that seemed to move in the corner of her eye, as if something was watching but always out of reach. It was a sensation she tried to push aside, attributing everything to her imagination. However, what started as minor discomforts soon became impossible to ignore. The oppressive heat returned. No matter the weather, the temperature, or where she was, Diana always felt a suffocating warmth, almost as if it were a constant reminder that something possessed her. The whispers followed. At first, they were faint, indistinguishable, like the sound of wind brushing past curtains. But over time, they grew clearer. Diana heard words she couldn't understand, spoken in a language that didn't seem of this world. These sounds came when she was alone, especially at night, in the silence of her new life as a future princess. Sometimes she woke in the middle of the night, feeling as though someone was in the room, but when she turned on the light, everything seemed normal. Even so, the air felt heavier, and the heat more stifling. The appearances started subtly, but soon became more frequent. A shadow crossing the hallway at Kensington Palace, a strange reflection in the mirror that vanished when looked at directly, or a tall, slender figure she glimpsed for a split second in the gardens. The most terrifying was the presence she felt behind her. During public engagements, surrounded by crowds, Diana had the impression that something was just behind her, watching, always in her peripheral vision. She could never see it clearly, but knew it was there. As months passed, Diana began to question her own sanity. She wanted to tell someone, but feared being labeled paranoid. After all, who would believe that the world's most beloved princess was being haunted by an invisible force? Instead, she kept everything to herself, trying to ignore the growing fear. But escape was impossible. The feeling of being surrounded by something, always present, became a part of her life. At night, in her most vulnerable moments, she felt she had made a terrible mistake in accepting the pact. The emotional isolation she began to feel was suffocating. Although she was surrounded by people, she felt lonelier than ever. The pact, which had promised love and adoration, now seemed like a trap that pushed everyone away. Diana realized her life was no longer her own. It was as if the figure that visited her that night had taken something from her, something she could never reclaim. What terrified her most, however, was the feeling that this was just the beginning. The wedding day. Diana's marriage to Prince Charles was, in the eyes of the world, the realization of a fairy tale. Oh, the dream wedding, right? At least, that's how the public saw it. For her, it was a different story. Millions watched every moment of the ceremony. It was impossible not to be enchanted by the image of the young princess walking down the aisle at St. Paul's Cathedral, with her voluminous dress and shimmering veil. But behind the radiant smile on her face, something was wrong. Diana felt a coldness emanating from within her, as if something was draining her energy. While her fingers trembled holding the bouquet, she couldn't help but glance around, certain that something or someone was watching her. There were moments during the ceremony when Diana struggled to focus on the priest's words. She looked at Charles, at the crowds, but felt that somewhere among the familiar faces and cameras, the presence that tormented her was also there. Only when the bells began to ring did she manage to collect herself, forcing a smile for the cameras and gripping her new husband's hand tightly. However, deep down, the weight of the ceremony felt like a reminder of the pact she had sealed. From that day on, she would no longer be just Diana Spencer. Now she was an icon, and icons, she discovered, paid dearly for their light. At the reception, surrounded by celebrities, royals, and the curious eyes of the world, Diana began to feel a familiar warmth rising along her spine. It was like being at the center of an oven, while everyone around her seemed comfortable and happy. For a moment, as she cut the cake beside Charles, she saw something in the reflection of the knife. A long, distorted shadow stood behind her shoulder. The fright was enough to make her hand tremble, nearly dropping the utensil. She laughed it off, pretending it was nerves, but the warmth and the weight in her mind lingered for the rest of the night. When she finally reached the bedroom that night, Diana hoped solitude would bring relief. But it was the opposite. As soon as the door closed, the room seemed to shrink, the shadows growing denser and the corners darker. Charles fell asleep quickly, but Diana stayed awake, sitting at the edge of the bed. The warmth returned, stronger than ever. It was as if something surrounded her, wrapping her in an invisible shroud of oppression. She looked into the large mirror in the room, and for a moment, she thought she saw something move behind her. The feeling of being watched had never been so intense. From that day forward, Diana's marriage wasn't just to Charles, but also to the pact she had made. Every official engagement, every public event, was a reminder that she now belonged to the world, and to something beyond it. Although she shone in front of the cameras and was constantly compared to a fairy tale princess, Diana knew there was much more going on. That night, as she closed her eyes and finally gave in to sleep, she heard a familiar voice whisper, "You're doing well, but remember, your time is running out." In the days that followed, Diana began to understand that the pact wasn't just a simple exchange. It was now part of her life, an invisible thread connecting her soul to that entity. And while she couldn't tell anyone, she felt that every step she took toward public adoration also brought her closer to the moment when the price would be collected. It was as if the entire world applauded her, while she unknowingly walked toward the abyss. Confrontation during pregnancy. When Diana discovered she was pregnant with William, she felt, for the first time in a long while, genuine joy. It seemed like, finally, something positive was emerging in her life. She was bringing an heir into the world, a moment of great celebration in the eyes of the royal family and the public. However, this happiness was soon tainted by something dark. Sleepless nights became unbearable. She would wake up drenched in sweat, with a crushing pressure on her chest. There was always an inexplicable, suffocating heat that seemed to radiate from the air around her. It was during one of these nights that she saw it again. Diana was alone in the room, gazing out the window at the Kensington Palace Gardens, when she felt a shift in the atmosphere. The heat suddenly increased, and the air became heavy, difficult to breathe. Then, in the reflection of the glass, she saw it, tall, thin, with elongated arms and fingers resembling claws. Its eyes, two black voids that seemed to devour all light, stared directly at her. Diana froze, unable to scream or move. Her instinct told her to run, but her body felt chained, as if bound by invisible forces. "You're doing well," the voice said, with a tone that seemed to come from every corner of the room. The entity didn't need to shout. Its words were like a cutting whisper that pierced Diana's mind. "They adore you, but time is running out, Diana." The figure tilted its head in an unnatural way, as if studying her every movement. Diana tried to ask what it wanted, but her voice came out trembling and weak. "You already know the answer," it replied before vanishing, as though it had never been there. The impact of that encounter was profound. Diana spent days unable to talk about what had happened, but she couldn't erase the vision of the entity's face from her mind. Something in its eyes told her there was no escape, no matter how hard she tried. In the weeks that followed, she began to feel a strange connection with the child she was carrying. It was as if he were her only anchor of hope in a world that otherwise seemed on the brink of collapse. Yet, the feeling of being watched never left her. Diana tried to focus on the future, on her new role as a mother, but the fear that the entity might return at any moment was overwhelming. The pregnancy, which should have been a time of happiness and fulfillment, became a constant reminder of the pact she had made. Even during the most intimate moments, as she caressed her belly or spoke to her unborn child, she felt the gaze of that being, hidden in the shadows, watching, waiting. And she knew that time was running out. With William's birth, Diana felt a brief sense of relief, as though her new identity as a mother could protect her. But deep down, she knew this wasn't true. The entity hadn't disappeared. It was merely waiting for the right moment to return. Diana began to realize that no matter what she did, her life was entwined with something far greater, something she couldn't control, and worse still, couldn't undo. Distorted reflection in the mirror. Mirrors had always been a source of unease for Diana. They surrounded her in her public and private life, constantly reflecting the image the world loved and revered. But for her, mirrors didn't just show what others saw. They revealed something more, something hiding just beneath the surface. The first time she noticed this was on a quiet night, months after William's birth. Diana was alone in her room at Kensington Palace, brushing her hair in front of the mirror, trying to find a moment of peace amidst the chaos her life had become. Then it happened. As she ran the brush through her hair, something in the reflection seemed to change. It wasn't immediate, but a subtle delay, as if the mirror was reacting a second late to her movements. It's that moment when your stomach sinks, like something's wrong, but you don't know exactly what. Diana stopped, tilted her head, and looked closer. There she was, but something was off. The smile was strange, forced, and her eyes were dark, hollow, almost lifeless. It lasted only an instant, but it was enough for her to step back abruptly, dropping the brush on the floor. The room was silent, but the mirror seemed to pulse with an energy she couldn't explain. That night, Diana tried to convince herself that she had imagined it all. Perhaps she was tired. Perhaps the distorted reflection was the result of her exhausted mind and heavy heart. But from that day on, mirrors began to unsettle her in ways they never had before. Whenever she looked at herself, she felt a presence, something beyond her own image, observing her. It was as though the glass was a door to another dimension, a portal through which the entity haunting her could watch her more closely. Even smaller mirrors, like car rearview mirrors, began to make her heart race. The most terrifying episode happened in 1995, during a stay at a hotel in New York. Diana was alone in her suite, preparing for a charity event. Dressed in one of her iconic gowns, she approached the mirror to adjust her necklace. When she raised her gaze, her reflection was no longer the same. Her eyes had turned into two black voids, deep and empty. The smile the image returned was grotesque, tearing across her face in a way that wasn't natural. Diana stumbled backward, falling to the floor. As she stared in terror, the reflection raised a hand as if trying to break through the glass. She screamed, but the sound died in her throat. Then the mirror began to crack slowly, as if it were being crushed from the inside out. Diana shut her eyes, covering her face with her hands, as the familiar oppressive heat filled the room. When she finally opened her eyes again, the mirror was intact, as though nothing had happened. But the mark on her soul remained, etched forever. Something inside her told her that time was running out. The figure that haunted her was closer than ever, and the mirrors were merely an extension of its watchful gaze. After that incident, Diana began avoiding mirrors whenever possible. At public events, she prepared quickly, relying on her assistants for final adjustments. At home, she requested that larger mirrors be removed or covered in her rooms. Still, the feeling of being watched persisted. Sometimes, she dreamt of distorted reflections, monstrous figures staring back at her from the glass. These dreams became so vivid that she woke up screaming, sweating, with the sensation of something burning her skin. Deep down, Diana knew the entity was manifesting more directly, and the mirrors were just the beginning. Public appearances. As the entity's presence grew stronger, Diana began to notice it wasn't confined to her private surroundings anymore. Until then, the manifestations had mostly occurred in her home, in her rooms, during her moments of solitude. But suddenly, she began seeing things during public appearances, surrounded by crowds, journalists, and flashing cameras. It all started at a charity event when Diana was greeting children at a hospital. As she bent down to speak with a young girl, she felt something pass behind her, swift as a shadow. When she turned, there was nothing there. These experiences began to repeat. At a gala dinner, Diana had the distinct impression that someone was watching her from a dark corner of the hall. It was as if a shadow stood there, motionless, just observing. She tried to ignore it, but every time she glanced in that direction, the feeling of discomfort grew. Later that evening, as she was leaving the event, she caught sight of a tall, slender figure reflected in the glass of one of the doors. She froze, unable to move, but when she blinked, the figure was gone. Diana knew she wasn't imagining it. This was real. The manifestations became more frequent and bolder. During a public appearance in the gardens of Kensington Palace, Diana was speaking with reporters when she saw, in the distance, a silhouette standing among the trees. Her eyes burned as she gazed at it, as if the presence drained all the energy around her. She lost focus for a moment, but quickly regained her composure, smiling for the cameras. Inside, however, her heart raced. Who or what was that figure? And why did it always appear at her most vulnerable moments? The most chilling occurrence happened during an overseas trip. Diana was attending a humanitarian conference, surrounded by delegates and photographers. As she moved among the attendees, she felt an unbearable heat, as though the air around her was being sucked away. When she looked toward a crowd of journalists, she saw something no one else seemed to notice. The tall figure with long arms and black eyes was standing at the back of the room, behind everyone. If that's not a way of reminding you what's coming, I don't know what is. Diana blinked rapidly, hoping it was just a trick of her tired mind, but the entity remained, tilting its head in a gesture that felt almost mocking. After that event, Diana began avoiding large crowds as much as possible. Even during official engagements, she became increasingly reclusive, preferring smaller interactions. The figure, however, never disappeared completely. It was always there, lingering at the edges of her vision, reminding her of the pact she had made and the price she would eventually have to pay. The public saw Diana as a strong and resilient woman, but inside, she was being consumed by fear. With each appearance of the entity, the feeling that her time was running out became more overwhelming. Psychological decline. By the 1990s, Diana's life was visibly unraveling. The world watched as her marriage to Charles collapsed, scandals dominated the media, and she struggled to distance herself from the rigid confines of the royal family. Yet, no one knew what was truly happening behind closed doors. Every day, Diana felt more isolated, as if she were being consumed by something unseen. Her friends and confidants began noticing changes in her behavior. She spoke with increasing anxiety about pressures and presences, without ever specifying what she meant. To others, it seemed like paranoia, but to Diana, it was her reality. The whispers, which had previously appeared in moments of solitude, now followed her during the day. Diana could hear them in crowded places, as though they were speaking directly into her mind while the world around her remained oblivious. During royal dinners, she often glanced around the room, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Charles accused her of acting strangely and began avoiding deeper conversations with her. Diana's behavior was dismissed as stress and the pressures of her position. No one imagined she was battling forces she couldn't explain. Her dreams also grew worse. Now they were recurrent and far more vivid. Diana dreamt of endless corridors where a figure followed her, its footsteps echoing with every move. In other dreams, she was trapped inside a mirror, unable to escape, while her reflection watched her with a monstrous smile. Whenever she woke, the oppressive heat that had plagued her life seemed stronger than ever. She began speaking in hushed tones to close friends, mentioning that something was wrong and that she felt her life slipping away. Her words were enigmatic, but carried an urgency that frightened those who heard them. The emotional toll of what she was experiencing became increasingly evident. Diana avoided large events and preferred spending time alone or with her children. The entity now seemed omnipresent, in her home, in the gardens, even during her overseas trips. The heat, once an uncomfortable constant, now seemed to permeate every aspect of her life. Some nights, she woke up gasping for air, feeling an unbearable pressure on her chest, as though something were trying to crush her. On other nights, she lay awake, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, waiting for dawn to bring some relief. The media, always hungry for any fragment of drama, began speculating about Diana's fragility. Rumors of emotional crises and mental instability spread quickly. Diana knew these stories were only surface level. What she was truly enduring was far darker. The entity's appearances were now more frequent and blatant, as though it were testing Diana's limits. It was almost as if it fed on her fear, constantly reminding her that the pact was alive and that the price would one day be collected. As the months went by, Diana began to understand what was happening. She wasn't just a woman being tormented by an entity. She was a symbol, a pawn in a much larger game where the rules had been set without her knowledge. Her struggle to escape, to find even a moment of peace, seemed futile. Deep down, she knew there was no way out. The pact she had made was etched into her soul, and the entity was drawing ever closer to claiming what it was owed. The presence in the tunnel. The night of August 31st, 1997, was one of the strangest in Diana's life. From the moment she left the Ritz with Dodi Al-Fayed, the atmosphere around her felt different. It wasn't just the summer heat of Europe, it was something else, something suffocating. Inside the black Mercedes, as they tried to escape the paparazzi, Diana felt an oppressive heaviness. The familiar warmth enveloped her, as if she were being consumed. She looked at Dodi beside her, hoping for some comfort, but even he seemed distant. A faint buzzing in her ears began softly, then grew into an overwhelming roar, echoing inside her head. When the car entered the Pont de El Alma tunnel, Diana had the eerie feeling that something was waiting for her. It was as if time slowed. The car's headlights illuminated the dark passage, but the shadows on the tunnel walls seemed alive, shifting. And then she saw it. Standing in the middle of the tunnel, tall, thin, arms extended as though welcoming her. Its eyes were black voids, swallowing the light from the car's beams, and its face distorted, flickering like a mirage. In that instant, Diana felt a coldness pierce through her body. She knew there was no escape. At the moment of impact, the sound of crumpling metal and shattering glass was deafening. Diana felt the heat intensify, as if she were being consumed by an invisible fire. Everything around her dissolved into chaos and darkness. But even as her consciousness faded, she saw it again. The entity stood by the wreckage, unmoving, like an executioner carrying out a sentence. Its voice resonated in her mind, soft but filled with malice. "Now you are mine." Those were the last words she heard before plunging completely into darkness. Diana's final moments were shrouded in an otherworldly silence. As rescue teams worked to save her, she hovered somewhere between life and death. In the depths of her mind, she could still feel the entity's presence. There was no more heat, only an emptiness, an oppressive void. For a fleeting moment, she thought of her sons, of all she still wanted to do. But something stronger pulled her away. The pact had been fulfilled. Her soul, promised that night in Kensington, now belonged to it. The tragedy made headlines around the globe. Millions mourned the loss of the people's princess, a woman who had given so much and received so little. But in the shadows, another story unfolded. Diana wasn't merely the victim of an accident or circumstances. She was the victim of something far greater, something that had begun long before that night in the tunnel. The entity that haunted her had finally claimed its due, leaving only emptiness behind. The world would never know the true battle Diana had fought, against forces beyond comprehension. The legacy of the Pact. Diana left the world as a legend, but the story she carried was never fully told. She became immortal in the public imagination, but what she truly lived through remains trapped in silence. That night in the tunnel, while the world saw a tragic accident, something far more significant was at play. It wasn't just a crash that took her life, it was the culmination of a pact that should never have been made. In the weeks following her death, close witnesses reported strange occurrences, though they were never comfortable sharing them publicly. A security guard working at the hospital where Diana was treated claimed he felt an oppressive heat in the room she occupied. Another mentioned seeing a tall, thin figure in the hallways, though security cameras showed nothing. The real unease came years later, on the day of her son William's wedding. While millions around the world watched the grand event, something unusual escaped most people's notice. In one of the chapel's ornate mirrors, a figure appeared briefly, tall, slender, with black, abyssal eyes. Some guests swore they saw strange movements in the shadows, but dismissed it as nerves or imagination. For a brief moment, William turned toward the reflection, as if sensing something. Then, he quickly composed himself. Diana may have been the first victim, but the pact she made seemed to echo, connecting somehow to those who inherited her lineage. Perhaps the price wasn't hers alone to bear, but one that extended to all who followed. And so, as the world celebrated the future of the monarchy, a shadow loomed silently, waiting patiently. Because some pacts don't end with a single life. They transcend generations, perpetuating a cycle that only ends when the final price is paid. This story is just one piece, and someday, perhaps we'll see the whole puzzle. If this made you think, subscribe and like the video. It helps the channel grow. Don't forget to share. More voices mean more discoveries. If you've made it this far, it's because something in this mystery captivated you. But I bet you haven't seen everything yet. Click on the next videos now to continue your journey into the unknown. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe so you don't miss the next secrets I'm about to reveal. But be careful. Once you step inside, there's no turning back.